All right, so we're picking up in chapter 7 of Mark tonight. So Mark chapter 7. Um, and Jesus Jesus is in Gennesaret. We last saw him there, and so he's um he's up near the Sea of Galilee. And chapter 7, it opens up. The Pharisees and some of the scribes gathered around him when they had come from Jerusalem and had seen that some of his disciples were eating their bread with impure hands, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they carefully wash their hands, thus observing the traditions of the elders. And when they had come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they cleanse themselves. And there are many other things which they have received in order to observe, such as the washing of cups and pitchers and copper pots. The Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat their bread with impure hands?" All right, so the scribes and Pharisees come to Jesus from Jerusalem. So they are actually um, either sent to him or go of their own initiative to investigate what's what's going on. So they travel to him with the accusation, "Your disciples eat with impure hands." Um, and they admit here that it's not a matter of the law that they're looking into. It's a matter of the traditions of the elders. That there are many traditions that they've received in terms of washing their hands, washing other objects. And this is not primarily a matter of hygiene. This is a highly ritualized washing where there's a prescribed amount of water they were to use, and they would I forget the order, but I think they would dribble the water down their fingertips and let it run off their elbows, and then rub their palms together with the water. And then they would go the other direction and run the water down their elbow, let it roll off their fingertips. And there was this ritualized washing that they would do as part of their tradition. That's not to say it has no root in the law. It has its roots in Exodus chapter 30, starting in verse 17. This is God's uh, God's commandment for the priest. So Exodus 30:17, Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "You shall make a laver of bronze, and its base of bronze for washing. You shall put it between the tent of meeting and the altar. You shall put water in it. Aaron and his sons shall wash their hands and their feet from it. When they enter the tent of meeting, they shall wash with water, so that they will not die, or when they approach the altar to minister, by offering up in smoke a fire sacrifice to the Lord." And so, um, this is kind of where the tradition of hand washing came from. Now, there were a lot of washings, a lot of sort of ritual washings that would end a time of uncleanness if somebody had a sickness or some other cause for impurity. Sometimes they would wash at the end of it. Um, but from this commandment for the priest, maybe from the some of the other commandments for washings to end a time of spirit of ritual impurity, they created this whole ritual of exactly how much water you're to use, how to let it run down your hand and your elbow, um, all from a commandment that applied only to the priests in the law. Um, and so Yet this tradition was so strong that the Pharisees had to come from Jerusalem to confront Jesus and the disciples and ask them, uh, why why are you not following the traditions of the elders? All right, so verse 6, and he said to them, this is Jesus speaking. He said to them, "Rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. Neglecting the commandment of God, you hold to the tradition of men. He was also saying to them, you are experts at setting aside the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and he who speaks evil of father and or mother is to be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father or his mother, whatever I have that would help you is korban, that is to say, given to God, you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or his mother, thus invalidating the word of God by your tradition, which you have handed down, and you do many things such as that. And so Jesus answers them on behalf of his disciples, and he says, um, "Look, you guys, you guys' reliance on tradition above God's commandments is actually prophesied." Um, and he calls them hypocrites. So he says, um, this people, quoting Isaiah, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. Um, and so he calls out what they freely admit is a tradition of the elders, and he calls them out for teaching it as a doctrine of God, seeing it as so important, something that they must impose on others. But he points out another another problem that always seems to crop up in legalism is not only that legalism condemns ordinary people for doing ordinary things, but it excuses the privilege for doing horrific things. And in fact, they apparently had a tradition that um, children wouldn't have to, grown children wouldn't have to take care of their parents if if they declared their possessions as devoted to God. But then they could come along later and say, well, now I want to use my possessions for myself. Now they're not dedicated to God anymore. And you see this so frequently when legalism rears its ugly head. The legalists always seem to carve out um, special privileges for the things they want to do and bring down the heavy hand of the tradition on others, um, making a big show of supposedly honoring God with their actions, while, as Jesus said, their hearts are far from him. All right, verse 14. After he called the crowd to him again, he began saying to them, listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside the man which can defile him if it goes into him, but the things which proceed out of the man are what defile the man. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. When he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples questioned him about the parable. And he said to them, Why are you so lacking in understanding also? Do you not understand that whatever goes into the man from outside cannot defile him, because it does not go into his heart, but into his stomach and is eliminated? Thus he declared all foods clean. And he was saying, That which proceeds out of the man, that is what defiles the man. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed the evil thoughts, fornications, thefts, murders, adulteries, deeds of coveting, and wickedness, as well as deceit, sensuality, evil, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these evil things proceed from within and defile the man. Um, and so, uh, Jesus Jesus sort of elaborates on this idea of um, why is it okay to eat without having an elaborate hand washing ritual beforehand. And he says actually there's a greater principle to it. What you eat doesn't defile you because it goes through your digestive system and it's gone. The things that are defiling are the things that come from the heart and lead to wickedness. And this is a radical teaching because if you guys remember back to when we were going through uh, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, all the laws, all the dietary laws are pretty extensive and pretty central um, to the way ancient Jews practice their religion, the way modern Jews still practice their religion. So it's really revolutionary for Jesus to come along and say, um, look, what you eat doesn't defile you. And it's kind of interesting, the disciples um, ask him about it. That's probably why they're confused about this thing. It kind of makes sense to us, right? Um, because we eat whatever, we eat all kinds of crazy things. But but they were very scrupulous about what they ate. And so Jesus explains it to him. And Mark's comment on it, on what Jesus says in the end of verse 19 is, thus he declared all foods clean. It's kind of an uh, um, interesting understanding. I wonder if Peter recognized it at the time, or if he came to realize it later while he's, explaining this to Mark. By tradition, Mark was a disciple. No, sorry, Mark was one of Jesus's disciples. Let's see. Yeah, Mark was by tradition was Peter's disciple, and so um, the question is, is um, did he understand at the time how revolutionary this is, how this would apply to Gentiles not having to eat kosher as they enter the first century church? Interesting thing to think about, but it really, if you remember back to Acts, when when God gives Peter the vision of the all the unclean animals in this sheet being lowered out of heaven, and says to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter says, "Not so, Lord. I've never eaten anything common or unclean." Um, Peter's still not getting it by the time he's going out and preaching the gospel in the book of Acts. And he has to have a vision to drive that point home, that um, neither the Gentiles nor the things they eat are unclean to God anymore. Um, and so, anyway, you can see Jesus is laying the foundation of that understanding for them, maybe introducing it little by little. But uh, Mark explains that this is the end result of that logic. All foods are clean. Verse 20 says, that which proceeds out of the man, that is what defiles the man. He goes on to list them: evil thoughts, fornications, thefts, murders, adulteries, deeds of coveting and wickedness, as well as deceit, sensuality, evil, slander, pride, and foolishness. So that's quite a list. Yeah, I think uh, in our day, in our common way of thinking today, in our movies and books and so forth, there's kind of this idea that um, someone who uh, gets caught up in sort of a destructive way of living, or a um, a way of living that harms themselves or others, uh, that deep down, that person is a good person, and it's just their actions that are bad, driven by necessity or whatever. Jesus says that our actions proceed from our heart. Um, and so the fact is, we've all got an evil heart that would love to propel us towards all kinds of deeds. Now we're all also created in the image of God, and bear His likeness, and so we've got kind of these two um, these two things at war within ourselves, and the flesh is going to win until we're born again. The power of God gives us new life, that we're able to resist the evil desires of our heart. All right, verse 24. Jesus got up and went away from there to the region of Tyre. And when he had entered a house, he wanted no one to know of it, yet he could not escape notice. But after hearing of him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately came and fell at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of the Syrophoenician race, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he was saying to her, let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. But she answered and said to him, yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs. And he said to her, because of this answer, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter. And going back to her home, she found the child lying on the bed, the demon having left. So Jesus goes to Tyre, which is a Gentile area, and he's trying to fly under the radar, but no such luck. And the Syrophoenician woman comes to him asking uh, that his daughter would be healed, that Jesus would cast a demon out of her daughter. Um, and I see in her a picture of intercession, where um, she comes to Jesus. Verse 26 says she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. She was persistent. And what's Jesus say to her? Let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Is this surprising to anybody else that Jesus said this to her? Right? It's a little surprising, right? Why do you suppose Jesus? I mean, we can recognize this. Um, this is kind of a rude answer, right? Why do you suppose Jesus gave sort of a dismissive answer like this? Well, I mean, there's obviously there's a lot of mystery on this, and a lot of people have given their opinion on exactly what's going on here. But I think Jesus is um, really uh, searching for the answer that she ultimately gives him. He's uh, waiting to see her demonstrate her faith. And she actually she actually uh, does something more than demonstrating faith. She demonstrates humility and faith in her answer. Um, well, before I get to her answer, I want to give a little bit of um, context to what Jesus says here. It was very common for first century Jews to refer to Gentiles as dogs. And Jesus actually uses a word for little dogs here. This is say, it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the puppies. Um, so, uh, what makes this odd to me is that Jesus intentionally sought out a Gentile area. And so he knows there are going to be Gentiles there. Um, he, uh, aside from his divine foreknowledge, he could reasonably expect people to seek him out for healing. He could expect Gentiles to seek him out for healing. And to that, his divine foreknowledge, he knows that this woman is going to come to him to deliver her daughter. Um, And so he's essentially saying to her, look, the miracles are for the Jews. Um, why are you, a Gentile, asking me for a miracle? Um, and so verse 28, she answered and said to him, yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs. And so notice what she does here. First, she says, yes, Lord. This is a very good way to start an answer to Jesus. Um, and she says, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs. So first she starts in a very humble way. She doesn't say, well, I'm not a dog. Who are you calling a dog? Um, she says, okay, I am what I am. I'm a Gentile. Um, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs. And she's saying, okay, well, um, I may be I may be lowly, I may be humble, but it is a very insignificant thing, is a very small thing to ask you to deliver my daughter. You recognize that, right? From Jesus's perspective, is it difficult for him to command the demon to leave this woman's daughter? No, not at all. It's a crumb. Um, and so uh, she demonstrates a great humility, but a continued persistence and a boldness to continue asking, and a reverence to recognize this is not a hard thing for God to accomplish. Um, Verse 29, he said to her, because of this answer, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter. And so uh, he cast out this girl's demon from a distance. Notice that the even the evil spirits have to obey him no matter where they are, even if he's not in their proximity. And verse 30, the woman goes back to her house, and the demon had left her daughter. Verse 31. Again, he went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee within the region of Decapolis. They brought him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty, and they implored him to lay his hand on him. Jesus took him aside from the crowd by himself and put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, he touched his tongue with the saliva, and looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, he said to him, Ephaphra, that is to say, be opened. And his ears were opened and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. And he gave them orders not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. They were utterly astonished, saying, he has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. So he goes back to the Sea of Galilee, to the region of Decapolis, which is still sort of a Gentile region, and he restores the hearing and speech of a deaf and mute man. It's interesting. He uses saliva. Apparently, this was a common practice of Jewish healers to use saliva. In healing. And so it's kind of interesting that sometimes Jesus healed in different ways. Why do you suppose Jesus healed in different ways and didn't always follow the same procedure when he healed people?
because he can do whatever he wants.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I think it's kind of a demonstration, actually. I think if he had always followed the same pattern, um, I think I think I would have been tempted to trust in it as a ritual and say, okay, well, somebody needs healing. I'm going to follow the exact way Jesus did it. And I think he wants us to remember the powers from God and not from a ritual. All right. Chapter 8. In those days, when there was again a large crowd and they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples and said to them, I feel compassion for the people because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance. And his disciples answered him, where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people? And he was asking them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, seven. And he directed the people to sit down on the ground, and taking the seven loaves, he gave thanks and broke them, and started giving them to his disciples to serve to them. And they served them to the people. They also had a few small fish, and after he had blessed them, he ordered these to be served as well. And they ate and were satisfied, and they picked up seven large baskets full of what was left over of the broken pieces. About 4,000 were there, and he sent them away. And immediately he entered the boat with his disciples and came to the district of Dalmanutha. All right, so Jesus is with his disciples. They're in the region of Decapolis, which is sort of a Gentile area around the Sea of Galilee. And and something happens very similar to just a couple chapters ago in chapter 6 of Mark. He's teaching the crowds. The people are there for a long time and they're hungry. And he turns to the disciples and says, um, "Hey, the people are hungry. Um, why do you suppose? What kind of response do you suppose Jesus is hoping to get out of the disciples here?"
Confidence and who he is. He can do whatever he wants.
Yeah. Yeah, right? Like he's hoping they'll be like, oh, hey, you did a miracle to feed the people in exactly this kind of situation. Why don't you do the same thing again? Right? I'm sure that's the response he's hoping to get. And how do his disciples respond? Where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people? Um, and so Jesus asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said seven. Um, and he directed the people to sit down on the ground, and taking the seven loaves, he gave thanks and broke them and started giving them to his disciples to serve them. And they served them to the people. There's some cool pictures here. I apologize if I'm repeating them from Mark 6. So I can't remember what I said last time. But anyway, there's this picture here where Jesus does the miracle, right? But he uses what the disciples have. The resources the disciples have are completely inadequate to feed this crowd. They've got seven loaves. But Jesus is going to use those loaves anyway. And Jesus does the miracle of multiplying those loaves. And we're told, sort of as an aside here, they had a few small fish also. Jesus multiplies those loaves and fish. Well, first he takes them, right? And the disciples have to be willing to give up what they have to serve the Lord. And he takes them and he multiplies them. And then he gives them back to the disciples to bless the people with, to just serve them to the people. Um, and so the disciples have a hand in this miracle, but it's Jesus who does the miraculous part of it. And uh, I see that picture applying to us too, that when God calls us to offer up what inadequate resources we have, if we're obedient to offer them up, we see him start to break them sometimes, and we go, "Whoa, what are you doing? That's mine." Um, but then we see him start to multiply, and when he gives them back to us, it's not that we would be selfish and eat all that bread ourselves, but that we would go and serve others with what he miraculously multiplies. And so he again he has them pick up the leftovers, and there's seven large baskets. Um, some have seen some interesting symbolism here. I'm just going to mention it, but in the previous miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, this was in a Jewish region, and there's sort of this picture of Jesus as the prophet like Moses, feeding them bread in the wilderness, the way God used Moses to feed them manna in the wilderness. So Jesus gives them bread in the wilderness, and they gather up 12 baskets full, um, which, that it's kind of easy to see the symbolism there, right? Like the 12 tribes, 12 baskets from Jesus feeding the Jewish people. Now here he's feeding people in a Gentile region, probably, probably some Jews there, but a lot of Gentiles, and they come up with seven baskets. Now, I don't know, the symbolism's not quite as obvious to me in that, but maybe um, seven being the number of completion speaks to the fact that God's plan is completed when the gospel is for everyone, not just the sons of Abraham, but the Gentiles as well. So, kind of some interesting symbolism there, and uh, at least it's a demonstration that um, the bread of life is for the Jew and the Gentile. The bread of life is for everybody, regardless of their nationality. All right, verse 11. The Pharisees came out and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, "Why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." Leaving them, he again embarked and went away to the other side. And they had forgotten to take bread and did not have more than one loaf in the boat with them. And he was giving orders to them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." They began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces you picked up?" They said to him, 12. "When I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up?" And they said to him, 7. And he was saying to them, "Do you not yet understand?" Um, and so they get in the boat, and apparently they forget to bring all the leftovers with them, or like any of the leftovers with them. They've got one loaf in the boat. And and Jesus says, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And immediately they hear the word leaven and their brains go to food. They say Jesus is being passive aggressive and he's mentioning bread because we forgot the bread. Um, and Jesus is not being passive aggressive here. He's being a little bit metaphorical. Um, but what is the picture? What is the picture of leaven teach us about the influence of the Pharisees and Herod?
It's how their sin infiltrates everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Leaven scripturally is a picture of sin, and and once it gets mixed in, it influences. Another thing is that it only takes a little bit of leaven to leaven a loaf of bread. And so it only takes a little bit of sin to completely corrupt something that started out good. Um, Now, what do you suppose the leaven of the Pharisees is here? What particular sins is Jesus warning against? Yeah, absolutely. Pride. Yeah. I think maybe also legalism. It's warning. And I mean, like, um, I feel like I get tempted to have a legalistic mindset. And there's all kinds of people in the church who have a mindset of you have to follow these rules. And yeah, there's a huge danger of legalism even in the church. What do you suppose is the leaven of Herod? What sin um would be the leaven of Herod?
Which one isn't? Sin, sexual immorality, pride. Um, where do I end?
Yeah.
Uh, there's so many.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Herods were a messed up family. They committed every sort of sin. Um, and there was also, if you remember, I think it was just a couple chapters ago, we saw the Pharisees and the Herodians conspiring against Jesus. And the Herodians were these were Jews who were trying to cozy up to Herod to gain political power. Um, and again, that's a huge warning for these guys as they're founding the church. Even today, um, we see the church tempted to seek political influence at the expense of the gospel. Um, and what's the problem with that? Well, if you go and try to get benefits from Herod, you're gonna have to be compromised um, in how you take a stand against his sin. Um,
Give the hair, hair.
right? Yeah, yeah, exactly. And we gotta beware um, lest we seek political power and it leads us to take a soft stand of righteousness. All right. And so Jesus warns them, they completely miss the point. And he says, verse 17, why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? So notice what Jesus says here is, um, you've got one loaf, right? That's enough for 1,000 people. Don't you recognize? Um, Jesus is not primarily concerned with physical things. He's not he's not going to fly off the handle because they forgot bread. Why? Because he can make bread. He's more concerned with their hearts. All right. And so he says them, do you not yet understand? All right, verse 22. And they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored him to touch him. Taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village, and after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, do you see anything? And he looked up and said, I see men, for I see them like trees walking around. Then again, he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored, and began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, do not even enter the village. And so, again, here we see Jesus healing a blind man, and he does it again with saliva. But this isn't how he always does it. This just happened to be two healings in a row where he did this. Um, Again, the power is the power of God. It's not the power of the ritual. But he heals this man. Something really unusual happens compared to all the miracles. What's different about this healing?
He wasn't completely healed first.
Yeah, exactly. It's gradual. He restores a little bit of his sight, and then he sort of gives him an adjustment, and he gets the rest of it back. Um, and I don't. Uh, I don't have a lot of application to make of that except to say that I imagine God can heal that way today too, right? That we can go to God for healing and be like 50% better. And I think we got a choice to uh, be grateful for what God has done and seek Him for the rest of the healing, or else we can be like upset that we're not 100%. And so I think this is a good reminder to just be grateful for what God has done, be diligent to continue seeking Him. Um, for the fullness of what he wants to do. Um, I think it's also I think it's also um, very striking that Mark puts this right after the disciples are slowly starting to have their spiritual vision um, given to them. And actually, he's going to sandwich it in between a couple, another story of the disciples slowly starting to see spiritual truths. And so I think this perhaps is there. I mean, first because that's how it happened, but second to illustrate um, to illustrate that just as this man's physical vision was restored slowly, it's going to take time for us to develop our spiritual vision and see God clearly, or more clearly, the way He is. Right, verse 27. Jesus went out along with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he questioned his disciples, saying to them, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, saying, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, but others one of the prophets." And he continued by asking them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ." And he warned them to tell no one about him. Um, Now, if you remember, uh, Matthew has a more a longer account of this conversation. Mark kind of gives us the brief account here, but Jesus starts off by asking the disciples a question, and who do people say that I am? Now, do you suppose Jesus didn't know what people said about him? No, he knew, right? Do you suppose he was so insecure that he needed to know what his reputation was? No, that's not it. He's trying to sort of introduce this question to the disciples. He's been demonstrating he can do the things that only God does. Um, but he wants the disciples to start thinking about that question. Who do people say that he is? And the people think he's a prophet, maybe one particular prophet. He says, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter gives the right answer. You are the Christ, or in Hebrew, you are the Messiah. Um, Now, who is or the Anointed One? What are the disciples, what are the Jews in the first century expecting in the Messiah?
Warrior.
Yeah, a warrior, right? Strength. Um, and Jesus is strong. Jesus is a warrior, but at his first coming, um, he set aside the the um demonstration of his conquering power and instead conquered through weakness, was victorious over death by being submitted even to the point of death. And so Peter's right here, um, but he warns them to tell no one. I suspect that's because even though they've got the words right, they probably don't quite have the ideas right yet. But Peter recognizes that he's the anointed one. Matthew tells us that Jesus told Peter, flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but the Father revealed it to you. Um, so, verse 31, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he was stating the matter plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interest, but man's." Um, so think about this from Peter's perspective. Jesus is just giving him an attaboy, and Peter's saying, "Hey, I hear from God. I'm the guy who hears things from God." And so when Jesus starts to teach them about things that sound very unlike their concept of the Messiah, he takes it upon himself to correct Jesus. He takes him aside and begins to rebuke him. Um, and Jesus turns around and rebukes Peter. And says, "Get behind me, Satan, for you're not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's." Um, Now this is pretty strong, right? Jesus calls Peter Satan, and this doesn't mean that Peter is is like demon possessed or anything like that. Um, but Jesus says exactly what the problem is, that he's not setting his mind on God's interest, but man's. And when we set our minds on our own preferences and our own idea of how things should be, that's when that's when Satan can use us. Which is kind of a sobering thought, isn't it? That we really need to have our minds set on the Lord, or otherwise we can really go astray very quickly. Go right from Jesus saying, "Great job, Peter. Flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you," to him saying, "Get behind me, Satan." All right, verse 34. And he summoned the crowd with his disciples and said to them, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. So Jesus had just been explaining to the disciples that he has to suffer, and then he calls the crowds to him and starts to explain that everyone who follows him is going to have to follow him to suffering. What's interesting about this is that um, Jesus is our leader, and he's not like one of these leaders who doesn't go himself. Jesus goes first and um, suffers the greatest thing anyone can suffer. Now, crucifixion was a horrible way to die, but Jesus' suffering was was really brought on by the weight of taking our sins, the sins of the whole world upon himself, and bearing the punishment of our sins. It was a spiritual suffering. And when Jesus warns the crowds, it's in recognition of this fact that if Jesus could suffer the consequence of sin, that we would never have to. Um, if we wish to follow him, then we shouldn't be surprised when we have to give up our lives, when we must suffer, um, when we must lose our lives in order to save our lives. Um, what does it mean? What does it mean for a disciple to take up a cross and follow Jesus?
We blame everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Laying everything down. Um, Paul talks about it in Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. And so, taking up your cross, it's taken this in uh, sort of colloquial usage. People talk about um, people talk about bearing a cross as sort of a um, a minor inconvenience, right? That person annoys me. That's just my cross to bear. That's not at all what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is talking about an instrument of execution, and the fact that his disciples must uh, must see themselves as uh, dead men walking, essentially, recognizing um, that we have already surrendered our lives to him. Now, the hard part is um, that we have to live that life of sacrificing our lives um, every day. Like we don't. Uh, it's not necessarily about one grand sacrifice for every disciple. But for every disciple, it means sacrificing all of the little things every day in obedience to Christ. Recognizing that I'm a dead man, I have no rights to do things my way if it's in opposition to his way. He says, "For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what will a man give in exchange for his soul?" Um, God has given us the most valuable thing there is, and it's an eternal soul that's created in His image, and uh, and the call of discipleship is a strenuous journey, but there is nothing else that is as worthwhile doing in this life. There's nothing else that's worthy of the life that God has given us. All right, so that's where we'll close tonight. Anyone have anything that stood out to you in these chapters that you want to share with the group? All right, well, let's close in prayer. Lord Jesus, we thank you for your example and for your leadership, the fact that you showed us the way to be surrendered. Um, Lord, I pray that you would give us the strength to live lives surrendered to your will, that we would be utterly transformed by your resurrection life. And pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right.